Hey everyone, today we are sewing up the Rockôtin Crossbody bag by Sacôtin Patterns. This is a generously sized crossbody bag. It is 12 inches wide, 8 inches tall, and has a depth of about 2 3/4 inches. It's a really great size bag. It will definitely fit your wallet inside and whatever else you may need to bring with you. It has a slip pocket with a flap closure with a magnetic snap on the front. It has 2 slip pockets and a pen pocket on the inside, and it also has a really generously sized zipper pocket. This pattern is a really good size to be your everyday crossbody bag. It looks so cute, and this is a really great opportunity to try out a designer that maybe you haven't tried before. The pattern is available in both English and French, so if you have seen the French version and panicked that you may not be able to do it, you can grab the version of the pattern in English, and hopefully this video will help you when you are sewing that crossbody bag so that you can also make a really, really cute new style for yourself. So let's get going. Before we start, I'm assuming that all of your fabric is cut and interfaced per the pattern directions and that relevant markings from the pattern are added for your magnetic snap placement and for your lining pocket. There is a link to the free pattern download in the video description. The first thing we're going to do is place our magnetic snaps. You have your lining flat piece and your exterior front pocket piece with the marks placed on the back. You can place those marks by putting a hole in your pattern piece and then marking it or poking a pen through the placement point on the pattern piece. I also like to check that my piece is centered by just folding my pattern piece in half to make sure that it is in the middle. And you can also double check that measurement with your ruler. When you're happy with that placement, take the washer portion of your magnetic snap and you're just going to draw the lines to make your slits. I like to use a seam ripper to cut those holes. I put the point of the seam ripper at the bottom of the line and then I poke it back out at the top and then slide up the line so that I don't cut any further into my material than is necessary to fit the magnetic snap. Take a piece of Decaville. I'm using Decaville Light. You can also use any other sturdy material like Peltex or vinyl, waterproof canvas, just to support the back of your snap. Put the same lines on the Decaville. You don't need to put the center mark. My pieces are approximately 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch. Take the stud portion of your magnetic snap and you're going to put that onto the flap lining piece with the stud side on the printed side. Place a piece of stabilizer over the back. If you're using a material that frays like cotton woven, then you can add some fray check just on those little slits so that they don't fray. Then grab your stud portion and you're going to put the stud on the flap with the stud side on the printed side of your material. Place your stabilizer over the prongs, then your washer. And you can fold those prongs in or out. I prefer to fold them out so that I get a flatter snap, but you can do it either way. And then you're going to back that with a piece of duct tape. And that is going to protect the material underneath. An alternative to the duct tape would be to fuse another piece of interfacing or fusible fleece over the top of that snap. Just make sure that that's adhered really well. And then do the same thing on the exterior front pocket with the socket portion through your slits, also with the fray check applied. Stabilizer over the top. Your washer. And then your duct tape. Take your exterior flat piece and we are going to now sew the flap right sides together. I like to draw in my seam allowance on my flap so that I make sure that I'm getting the point at the right spot. We're going to be sewing at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, so I'm just going to draw that line in. And then I like to make sure that my center point is lined up. And I'll also draw that at the sides. We're going to be sewing around the sides and the angled section. We're not going to be sewing the top part of the flap. Clip those right sides together. And then we're going to sew around these sides at 3/8 of an inch, backstitching well at the beginning and the end, and making sure to hit as close to the point as we can. Once you've sewn those 3 sides, take your scissors and we're just going to snip the extra material at the corners to reduce the bulk when we turn the flap out. We're also going to snip just at the point here, making sure that we're not cutting too close to our stitch line. We're now going to turn out the flap. Gently poke the corners out, first using your thumb or a finger, and then if you have a point turner or a chopstick, just gently slide it along the seam to poke out that corner. I like to roll my seams also to help it to sit nice and flat, and if you have a seam roller, you can just press that so it has a crease there. When you're happy with your flap, you can top stitch around the entire outside edge. The pattern instructions say to top stitch around here at 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to also close up the top of my flap so that it sits nicely when I continue to construct the exterior of my bag. And I'm going to be top stitching with a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance rather than 1/4 of an inch because that's my preference. But you can use whatever your personal preference is. Just be careful of your snap when you are sewing around, and if you are going to be just top stitching these outside edges, make sure you keep your back stitching within the top 3/8 of an inch, as that will be the seam allowance that we attach the flap to the bag with. Using a longer stitch length and sewing all the way around. You want to make sure that your top stitching is hitting right at that point if you can. Retrieve the remaining pieces for the exterior front of your bag. The first thing to do is to sew your flap to your exterior top panel. We're going to mark the center on the bottom of our flap and the lower edge of our exterior top piece A, which is the longer edge. And then center your flap up so that the raw edge of your flap is lined up with the long edge of your top panel. The instructions here say to sew a line at 1 inch from the lower edge onto the flap to attach it to that exterior top panel. However, I'm going to make sure that my magnetic snap placement is correct before I sew that line. So for the meantime, I'm just going to base the flap in place to the lower long edge of this exterior top panel. Take one of your flap pieces. This is the inside of the flap pocket, and you're going to also mark the center on that one, and you will place it right sides together with your flap that is basted to your exterior top panel and clip that in place. This is the piece that will form the back of your front flap pocket. I am using the same material as my exterior for this, but you can use your lining fabric. Clip that in place, lining up the centers and the edges. We're going to sew along here at 3/8 of an inch, sewing through the back lining piece of the front flap pocket, the flap itself, and the exterior top panel. We are going to sew all the way along, back stitching at the beginning and the end, and taking care when we get to the flap of the bulk there. I will use a hump jumper to help me get up over that flap, and I'm also going to put some extra stitches to reinforce the stress points. Using my stiletto to help that upper section just hug around that flat piece, and then I pop my hump jumper behind and continue along. When I'm happy that I'm on that flap, just back stitch and continue straight. Using my stiletto at the other end to hold that exterior piece taut, and then as the gap forms underneath that presser foot, when I come down off the bulk, I'm going to take my hump jumper, pop it underneath so that the presser foot does not jump off that bulk there and create a skipped stitch. And then I still want to reinforce that, so just head back there and continue on. When the presser foot is clear of that bulk, I can remove my hump jumper and sew straight to the end. We're now going to fold that seam allowance down towards the main part of the bag. We're going to top stitch below that flap, sewing through this lining pocket piece and the seam allowance. You can press that with your seam roller or your iron and top stitch at your chosen top stitching seam allowance, 1/8, 1/4 of an inch, whatever your preference is. You can also make a small snip at the corner there just to reduce some of that bulk for when we sew the side seams. When I'm top stitching here, I'm going to start my top stitching in the side seam so that I can back stitch, and then I will be sewing straight along on this lining piece just below that fold, keeping the flap nicely out of the way. And again, where there's bulk, I'll be ready with my hump jumper. Pivot and back stitch again in the side seam allowance. Working now with your exterior piece with the magnetic snap socket and your other front flat pocket lining piece, you're going to place them right sides together and then clip along this upper edge. We're then going to sew along here at 1/4 of an inch, fold it out, press the fold nice and smooth, and then top stitch at your chosen top stitching seam allowance. I'm again going to put a small snip in the corner there just to reduce that bulk, and then I'm going to fold that out and I'm going to top stitch on the exterior. Back stitching in the side seam allowance first, and then top stitching along the upper edge. I'm going to be using 1/8 of an inch. Now we can check the placement of our magnetic snap. And what I'm also going to do is baste this exterior pocket to the main part of my bag. I'm going to line it up along the bottom edge. I'm going to clip it in place, starting at the center. But what I'm also going to do is just pull it in slightly from the edge. When you finish your bag and you fold this front pocket around, you can get some puckering here because the pocket is pulling on it. These are the same width, and when you put things in the bag or you fold the bag around to create the final bag shape, there will be a little bit of bunching. To reduce that bunching, you can just pull the pocket in slightly from the edge. It's about 1/4 of an inch in. That still will be sewn within the seam allowance, but it just creates a bit of space there that will allow your pocket to sit nice and flat on the front of your bag. So it's lined up still at the bottom, but at the top here, just coming in about 1/4 of an inch from the outside edge. You can see that it's gaping a bit here, but that's okay because when the bag is done and it folds around, it'll sit nice and flat. And then basting the exterior flat pocket in place, making sure that it's well within what will be a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm also going to do a few reinforcing stitches at the top corner. The next thing that I need to do is sew this line on our flap that we skipped earlier in our construction. So to get the correct placement, I'm going to close over my flap, make sure that it snaps in place, smooth it out, and then I can see where I need that line to be. You have to allow for the fold in the flap. So I'm just going to measure, and my line is going to be about 3/8 of an inch up from the fold. So I'll draw in that line, and it's about 1/8 of an inch below, maybe 1/4 of an inch below the line per the pattern instructions. So it really depends on the type of magnetic snap that you've used and your exact placement, which is why I suggest waiting to sew this line until you have placed your snaps and basted your pocket in place. Otherwise, your pocket is not going to sit nice and flat. Check that again. That's nice and smoothed out, even on both sides. And then I'm just going to sew along this line. You can backstitch at the beginning and the end, or you can take long tails and pull them through and tie them off. You can also add a rivet at either corner there if you want for added security. Pull those tails through and tie those off at both ends. If you can't pull it through, just use a needle to tuck it through the stitch line. Take your last exterior front piece. You can mark the center on this. Then you're going to line it up right sides together with the lower edge of that flat pocket. Sew it at 3/8 of an inch and then fold it down, and we will top stitch. Sewing straight down this edge, back stitching at the beginning and at the end, sewing at 3/8 of an inch. Going to snip into the corner to reduce that bulk. And then I will fold this bottom section down, and I will be top stitching through the lower section and the seam allowance of that pocket. To help this to sit nice and flat, you can just put a crease in that fold there. And now that exterior front is finished, we can move on to the exterior back. Starting with your strap connectors, we're going to draw a line straight down the middle. I am using 2-inch wide rather than the measurements given in the pattern instructions because I'm going to be using 1-inch hardware. So you want your strap connectors to be double the interior diameter of your hardware, whatever that is. What we're then going to do is fold the long raw edges in to meet that center line. You can use double-sided tape if you like, or you can just press those. Once those are all pressed, we need to top stitch around the outside. You can top stitch around the entire strap connector and then slide it through your rectangle ring, or you can slide it through first and then when you have your connector ring in place, sew around the 3 sides. I find that kind of tricky to get close enough to my rectangle ring, so I am going to sew all the way around both of my connector tabs before sliding on the D-ring. Sewing all the way around, starting and stopping in one of the short ends using a longer stitch length and sewing at 1/8 of an inch or whatever your preferred top stitching seam allowance is. Slide the rectangle rings on, and we're then going to baste our connectors to our exterior. You're placing them on the narrower upper edge, 1 inch from the outside edge, and you're going to baste that within the seam allowance. Use a piece of painter's tape to just keep those rectangle rings from flopping around. And then clip your other piece F, the lower exterior piece, right sides together, lining up the long lower edge of the center panel with the long upper edge of that piece. You can mark your centers to help you get your placement. Sew along this bottom edge at 3/8 of an inch, the same way as we did for the exterior front piece. Once you've sewn that seam, we're going to put a snip within the seam allowance, not snipping into our stitch line. That is 3/4 of an inch from the outside edge. When we fold down our seam allowance to top stitch, we will fold just the center section down and the side section will be folded up, and that will help us to reduce the bulk in our finished side seams. So press the center section down, but this side section is going to go up so that at the side here, we will not have as much bulk where this bottom section joins up between the front and the back panels of the bag. So press the center section down and the upper section up. You can also put some double-sided tape in the sides there to help keep that outside piece folded up. We'll now top stitch along this bottom fold. We are going to be top stitching on the lower section the whole way, even though here at the side, this section is taped up, but I am going to stop my back stitching at the side here to help secure that at the outside edge. We are not going to be attaching the upper section to the exterior back just yet, so set that aside and retrieve one of your lining pieces and your 2 zippered pocket pieces. Take your 2 zipper pocket lining pieces and working with the longer edge, you're going to fold that up 3/8 of an inch and press that fold. This is a memory fold that will help us close up that pocket later. Take one of your main lining pieces and your zipper pocket lining piece that has the rectangular mark on the back, and you're going to position it so that it is 1.5 inches down from the upper edge, lining up the sides. And then clip or pin that in place. I like to double check that the box that I have drawn here is parallel to the upper edge, and then you will sew on the line using a shorter stitch length and taking care to hit directly in the corner of that rectangle. Take a ruler and a pen, and we're going to draw a line straight down the center of that rectangle. And we're also going to draw a V shape going up to those corners. We're then going to cut straight on that center line and then snip up to the corners, being careful not to cut through any of our stitches. We're now going to take our pocket lining and tuck it through the opening that we just made, passing it through to the wrong side of that lining piece. And now we will press those folds away from the opening, creasing it with an iron or a seam roller and making sure to pull it out as neatly as you can at the corner. If you are having trouble at the corner, you may need to just snip a little further into your pocket piece. Taking care not to cut into the stitches. Once you've pressed that pocket opening out, take your zipper. If you're using zipper by the yard, make sure that your pull is on at this point. If you're using a dress zipper, then I suggest basting closed the open end to keep the sides of your zipper tape well aligned while we install the zipper. Working from the back, place double-sided tape along the long edges of your zipper window. You want to make sure that your zipper tape is at least 1 inch wider than your zipper opening. So the zipper opening is 8 inches. I have my zipper tape cut to 9 inches. I'm going to use zipper by the yard. If you're using a dress zipper, then you're going to want to make sure that the section of teeth is at least 8 inches. That will leave the stops just inside your zipper window. But if you do a 9 inch or longer zipper, then those stops will be hidden on the outside, or you can just remove those. I'm going to cinch the ends of my zipper by the yard and place my pull, and then we will get it positioned within that zipper window. Remove the backing from your double-sided tape and then place it over the top of your zipper. You want to center your zipper teeth within that rectangle opening. You can choose whether you want to have your zipper pull opening from left to right or right to left. I like to start at either end, center it up, and then move my pull as I go to make sure that it is straight and that there's even spacing on either side of my zipper teeth. If you're confident getting your pulls on, you can also just stick the zipper tape down without the zipper pull on, leaving this end unsewn. So along here first, cross over, sew down here, part of the way, and then slide your pull on, slide it all the way up, and then finish sewing around so that you get a nice straight stitch line. When you're happy, sew around this entire box, securing the zipper tape to that lining panel and also sewing through the inside zipper pocket piece. When I come up to my zipper pull, leaving the needle down, I will pivot, slide it out of the way, keep sewing along that upper edge, turn at the corner, then slide the pull back up the other end and finish sewing around. I'm going to pull my threads through to the back without back stitching, and then I will tie a knot to secure those and tuck them between the layers rather than back stitching. Just tying these threads together, then I will take a needle. I'm just going to tuck it underneath the zipper tape and that zipper pocket lining. Poke it out within the seam allowance. Pull those tails through, and then I can snip those. And I'm also going to correct that corner that I've missed there. Just going to tuck my needle through where that hole is. Take a small piece of matching thread. Pull it through first on one side I want the thread to straddle that skipped corner stitch. Just going to hold it at one end, pull it all the way through, take it to the other side. So that will pull that corner up there at the top. I do have a quick fix video showing you how to do this. And then I'm also going to catch the corner on the back. I'm just going to pull this thread back underneath on the back too. It doesn't matter which end. And once I've caught it on the front and the back, I can tie a knot, and then I will thread it underneath the zipper tape the same way as we did where we finished off our stitches. If you're worried about your zipper pull coming off, you can also fold open the end here and just add some extra stitches right here that won't be seen from the outside. Take your other zipper pocket lining and put that right sides together with the one we just sewed in place. And we're going to clip around the outside, and then we're going to sew around the 3 edges, excluding this folded bottom edge that we'll use when turning the bag. We're going to be sewing around the short ends and the upper edge. You want to be careful to keep your lining piece folded out of the way and make sure that both zipper pocket lining pieces are nice and smooth underneath. You can sew at 3/8 of an inch, or you can sew with a slightly greater seam allowance that will help keep your zipper pocket away from the side seams when we're finishing sewing up our bags. I am sewing across the top first, starting about 1/2 inch in from the outside edge and back stitching. And I am sewing at a seam allowance of approximately 5/8 of an inch. Take care of this part of your zipper pocket, as around this point is where it's going to want to pull away from the upper edge of the backing of that zipper pocket. Slide your pull as you need to. Back stitching again about 1/2 inch from the outside edge of that zipper pocket. Fold up the side, and I'm going to sew down here at 5/8 of an inch also, just crossing over a little with that stitch line that I just finished. I'm back stitching well where that fold is at the bottom. And then I will head over to the other side, and I'm going to sew this one with the same seam allowance, leaving just the bottom where we have folded up the edge open. We're now going to sew our lining patch pocket. So working with your 2 remaining lining pieces, your piece B and your second full lining piece, you're going to place the lining slip pocket right sides together, and you're going to sew along the top and the bottom edges, leaving the sides open, sewing at 3/8 of an inch. You can back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Trim all of those threads and also make that snip in the corner that we've been making to reduce our bulk. We're then going to turn this slip pocket out through one of the short edges and press that before we top stitch the upper edge of this pocket piece. Roll and press those seams out using your iron or a seam roller. Once you've pressed those creases nice and flat, you're going to top stitch along just the upper edge, which is the narrower of the two long edges. Find the center of that slip pocket piece and you're going to draw two lines, 5/8 of an inch each from that center marking using a removable pen. Take your exterior and make a mark 1/4 of an inch from the outside edge at the top. Position your slip pocket on your remaining lining piece using the measurements given in the pattern, making sure that it is centered up. We're now going to secure the slip pocket to the lining piece. I'm going to place a clip at the bottom corner. But what I am then going to do is the mark that we made here at 1/4 of an inch, I'm just going to slide the lining in to make that mark. So the opposite of what we did for the slip pocket on the exterior where we pulled it in because the bag was going to curve out, the lining is going to curve in. So to avoid having a floppy pocket on the inside, we just need to pull that slip pocket slightly into the seam allowance. So I'm going to use that mark as a guide, line that up with the outside edge, and place a clip. And you can see that it's just going to angle slightly, and that is going to help reduce any gaping on the inside of our bag. Going to do the same for the other side. Smoothing out the lining underneath. And then we are going to baste these sides here. And also we are going to baste along the bottom edge. And we're also going to be sewing up this line and this line. To keep the center section nice and smooth, you can put some pins here or some painter's tape so that the extra slack that we're taking out of the slip pocket here doesn't affect the center pocket. Basting the back first so that I can see where I'm going, where I've angled that slip pocket. And then for the bottom stitch line, it is not a basting stitch. This is the stitch line that is going to secure the bottom of your slip pocket. So you want to use a shorter stitch length, and you want to make sure that you are securing your stitches at the beginning and at the end. You can continue sewing straight across here and then sew these lines separately, or if you wish, you can turn up and sew this line up and back down, rather than having to start and stop over and over again. It's a little easier when you can see the line. Trim your threads and also trim the excess slip pocket that is hanging over the edge of your lining panel. Don't worry that at this point your lining panel is not sitting flat. Before we can go any further, we need to check the corners on our bags. This bag has a box bottom, so we need to check that the bottom of our bag will be flat when we sew our side and bottom seams. To do that, you want to line up your lining and exterior panels and check that the edge here is nice and straight. This is pretty close, but it does have a slight angle. If you place what will be the side seam of the bag against a straight line, you can see that it just is about, it's barely even 1/8 of an inch, but it is not quite straight. If you use your ruler and you place it against the bottom, you you can see that this angle in here is not a 90-degree angle. To sit flat on your surface, it needs to be 90 degrees. So we're just going to correct that quickly. And the way to do that is just grab your ruler, make sure anything below, like that zipper pocket, is out of the way. Line up the straight edge on your ruler with the side seam of your bag, and you're just going to trim that tiny little triangle off so that when you box your corners, you won't get that kite shape. It will sit nice and flat. You're going to do that for your lining pieces, and you're also going to do that for your exteriors. I will link the video with the full explanation of this in the description. And just to compare, this one that has the corrected angle to make it 90 degrees, this being the side seam of the bag, this being the part of the bag that is going to be the base. If you have that compared to this one, line them up, and it just sits ever so slightly lower. So that's the little bit that we're just trimming off. Otherwise, the bottom of your bag will kind of bow down. Once that correction has been made, we can start working on installing our top zipper. You can do a zipper that has a tab on either end, or you can have one end turned. I'm going to show you a tab on both ends this time. You want to make sure that your zipper is the correct length. You want your finished zipper length to be 11 inches. So make sure that your zipper is cut to size, and then cinch the end so that you don't get any fraying. Slide your pull on and take your tab piece. I'm going to cut it in half, and then you're going to fold it so that the short raw ends are tucked into the center. So you're going to fold it in half long ways first, open it back out, fold the short ends in to meet that center crease, and press it again. Then you're going to wrap the folded zipper end tab around the raw ends of your zipper and sew that in place at 1/8 of an inch. Mark the center point of your zipper and of your exterior and lining pieces. For the exterior back, you're going to mark the top and the bottom of the upper piece and the top of the lower piece that has your strap connectors attached to it. Working first with your slip pocket piece, center up your zipper tape so that the pull is to the right side. This is the inside of the front of the bag, and we're going to clip this in place, or you can use double-sided tape to secure that. We're then going to baste this zipper at 1/8 of an inch. Make sure that you slide your pull out of the way as you need to get a nice straight line with your zipper tape. You want to make sure that you have even spacing at either end of your zipper. Baste along that edge. Retrieve your exterior front piece with the flap. Line up the center mark with the center mark on that zipper. Your zipper is right now facing up on the lining, and it will be facing right sides together with your exterior. Clip it in place, lining up the center mark and the outside edges. We're going to sew through the exterior, the zipper tape, and the lining. You can use 1/4 of an inch up to 3/8 of an inch, depending on what your zipper width is and what your preference is. Backstitching at the beginning and at the end to secure that zipper tape in place. I'm using my zipper foot and a seam allowance of 5/16 of an inch. The important thing is that you are consistent with your seam allowance and that you keep your zipper pull out of the way so you have a nice straight zipper. I have not yet top stitched next to my zipper, so I don't want to keep changing my thread. So instead, I'm going to install the other side of my zipper first. Fold the lining and the exterior out of the way. You can place a couple of clips just to keep it tucked up. And now we'll work on the second side of that zipper. Lining up the center mark with the center of our other lining piece. We have the wrong side of the zipper facing down on the right side of the lining. Clip it all the way to the end, lining up the edge of the zipper tape with the edge of the lining. You might have some overhang of your tab, and that is fine. You want to have the zipper tape lined up. You can trim that tab if it's tricky for you to position it with the overhang. The same way as we did on the first side, we're going to baste that zipper tape to the lining at 1/8 of an inch, making sure we're keeping a nice straight edge with no waves in our zipper, and that the zipper is pulled up nice and snug to that lining. Because of the bulk of this front panel, it may want to pull away a little, so you just might need to manipulate it a little as you go. And you can also use double-sided tape to keep that in position if you're having trouble with just the clips. Take your exterior piece A and line up the centers and the edges. You want to make sure that it is the slightly narrower long edge that you are securing to your zipper, not the longer one. The longer one attaches to the lower part of your back exterior panel. Slide the zipper pull out of the way as you need to. And then we're going to sew along this edge using the same seam allowance as we did for the other side of the zipper so that we get consistent spacing on both sides of our zipper teeth. And you also want to take care when you get to the tabs to make sure that you are not missing any stitches as you get over that bulk. Once you've sewn both sides of the zipper, check that you are happy with the spacing on either side of your zipper teeth and that you are happy with how straight that zipper installation is. When you're satisfied, we can top stitch on either side of that zipper opening. When you're top stitching on either side of your zipper, you can either top stitch from one end all the way to the other, however, not top stitching through your lining. So just sewing through the exterior and the seam allowance, but keeping the lining out of the way. Or if you want to top stitch through your lining and your exterior, then you are going to start and stop on either side of the zipper tab, leaving this end bit untop stitched so that you can properly sew your side seams. If you sew the lining and the exterior all the way to the end, when you go to join up your side seams here, your lining is going to be pinched up here, so it's not going to come out nicely to sew the lining of your bag, which is going to result in a pinched in seam as the lining pulls that exterior into the body of your bag. I have videos for both of those methods that I can put a link to. Today I am going to be sewing just the exterior and sewing all the way along. So I'm going to tuck my lining out of the way. You can just press that down. However, I'm going to place some double-sided tape to create a nice clean fold in my vinyl. I've got my tape. It's 1/8 of an inch just within the seam allowance. I will press it over. And then I will be top stitching at 1/8 of an inch on either side of this zipper so I won't be hitting that double-sided tape. Do the same on the other side. And then I'll be top stitching along here and along here. Back stitching in the side seam and using a longer stitch length. Sewing just through the vinyl, and my lining is here out of the way. So it's my exterior top and the seam allowance. And then take both lining pieces to the other side. So I just have my exterior and the seam allowance here also. And do the same thing. With that top stitching completed, double check that you haven't sewn the lining. And now we can attach the lower part of the exterior. Lining up the center markings and clipping along all the way to the edge. When I'm clipping, I'm going to clip around the connector tab, and when I am sewing, I'm going to use my stiletto to tuck the lower piece and the upper piece around that connector so that there's no gap. We're going to sew this in place at 3/8 of an inch, and then we're going to fold it open, press that out, and we're going to top stitch along this edge at 1/8 of an inch. Before I top stitch this seam, I'm going to put the same snips as we did for the exterior front, 3/4 of an inch in from the edge to fold that edge the opposite direction to the front panel so that you have less bulk at the side seam. So I've placed a small snip here, just shy of where the stitch line is. Then I can fold that exterior back panel out, press that in place. But I will keep this side piece folded up to reduce the bulk at the side seam when we join it to the exterior front of the bag. And then I will be top stitching along below the fold. Secure your strap connector tabs to the exterior upper panel on the back with either a line of stitches or with rivets. If you are going to use rivets, I suggest backing it with a piece of stabilizer so that it doesn't pull through your exterior vinyl. I'm going to punch my holes for my rivets in the center of the strap, about 1/2 inch below where the lower end of my rectangle ring is. Check that the placement is equal on both sides. And then I'm going to punch it through all of the layers, making sure that it is not slipping around when I do so. Then I'll set those rivets in place. With the exterior and the linings now complete, we need to sew around the outside of our bag. Make sure that your zipper at the top is open and that your lining zipper pocket is open. We're going to be sewing around the entire outside except for boxing the corners, and then we're going to turn our bag through this hole. We're first going to be sewing around the entire outside. The lining piece and the exterior piece on this pattern are the same size, so when we are sewing our lining, we are going to take a greater seam allowance. The first thing that I like to do is match up landmarks. So I will place clips where there are folds in the vinyl at the ends of the upper section of the bag, and also where we have our accent pieces towards the bottom. I also like to place staples at those points. I will do the clips first, and then I will do staples to secure them. You also want to fold your lining zipper pocket out of the way of the side seams. Once I have the outside edge all clipped and my zipper pocket clipped out of the way, I'm going to place staples At each of these landmark points where I have different colors or different materials that are lining up, that will help me get a well lined up edge on my bag. Place my staple within the seam allowance and just make sure that the prongs are sitting nice and flat. If there's an area like at the end of the zipper where you have the thinner layers of the lining and the bulkier exterior, place your staple through the thicker area so that it is more secure rather than straddling over that seam. Use your pliers to flatten down any of those prongs that are sticking out a little. These staples will come out after we have sewn the side seams. Before we go over to the sewing machine, we're just going to mark on our lining where we are going to start tapering. An inch down from the edge, I'm just going to make a mark. So we will sew 3/8 of an inch on the exterior and to here on the lining. At this point, we're going to come in to 5/8 of an inch. So that's an extra 1/4 of an inch. But we want it to be gradual. So I'm just going to make some marks here. But you want to have completed it by about 1/3 of the way down. So if I mark here and here, then I can just draw a line. So this is 2 1/4 inches down from the seam. This is 1 inch down from the seam. And then I've just drawn a line there. And that is where I'm going to take my greater seam allowance. So I can just show you what that will look like all the way down. And that will help the lining to nest inside. When we box our corners, we're still going to be boxing it with 3/8 of an inch. If you box it with 5/8 of an inch, it's actually going to create a bigger box for you. So do the same on the other side. You want to mark that is 3/8 in from the edge and 1 inch down, and a mark that is 2 1/4 of an inch down from that seam and 5/8 in. And you can angle that here. Just want to make sure that that lining is nice and smooth underneath. And then you can measure that all the way down. So the normal seam line, if you did 3/8 of an inch, would be here. But this will mean that your lining is the same size as your exterior. But because the lining has to sit inside the exterior, it has to be slightly smaller. If you think of it like nesting dolls, it has to be smaller to be able to fit inside. But the width at the top needs to be the same so that you have nice neat corners here. So we will sew at 3/8 until we get to here, and then we will taper in. We'll also take the greater seam allowance at the bottom. But in order to have a smaller box when we box our corners, if we do 5/8 of an inch, we're going to end up with the same size box as we have on the exterior, which is what creates the depth of the bag. But we need to have a smaller depth for that lining to sit snug in the bottom of the bag. So you can do 3/8 of an inch, or you can do 1/2 an inch, but I wouldn't do the full 5/8 of an inch. But we can talk about that when we come to boxing the corners. So we'll be sewing 3/8 around the exterior, coming into this point, and then sewing at 5/8 the rest of the way around. And this is still squared up because we've kept a straight line here. So I'll head over to the sewing machine, sewing all the way around, only skipping over the corners. I don't need to leave a turning hole because I'm going to be turning through my zipper pocket. Something to consider before you start sewing around the outside of your bag is what color thread you are going to use. I like to use a thread that matches the exterior of my bag so that if there are any visible stitches, they are less noticeable. However, with this pattern, there are sections that have a lot lighter material than the main color that I've used for the bag. So I am going to sew the section on my exterior center panels with a different thread color first, and then I will sew around the entire outside with my darker thread color, and I would just stitch a second line inside the lighter thread color on those sections so that at the side seam, you cannot see those visible dark threads. Backstitching at the beginning and the end at each of my boxed corners. When you come down off the bulk there, where your exterior and your lining meet up, you may get some longer or skipped stitches, so a hump jumper will just help support that presser foot and make sure that you're getting consistent stitches. When I come up to that line, I'm going to come in a little more to take my greater seam allowance. You can also just gradually angle it in, but by measuring the seam allowance change at the top there, you can make sure that your bottom corner will still be nice and straight. Just repositioning my needle so that it is easier to get past the zipper tab here. This can be kind of tight. If you have trouble getting past there with your regular presser foot, then you can switch to a zipper foot. I like to reinforce at the area where the exterior meets the lining. Remove any staples that you placed earlier and trim all of your threads. And now we're going to box our corners. To line up your boxed corners, you're going to open out your side and bottom seam and match up the center at the bottom of your bag and the center of your side seam. And then you're going to clip along the straight edge. Because we corrected the angle, this should sit nice and flat. You can choose to either fold that seam allowance open, or you can choose to push it to one side on the top and the other side on the bottom and nest them together to reduce the bulk. And when you push them slightly into each other, that will help that bottom corner to line up very nicely. One consideration is that when you do that, you want to make sure that the center seam is going the same way when you do that, either this way or that way, and then opposite at the side. If you are going to fold it open like this, then you can put some double-sided tape within that seam allowance to help that to sit nice and flat. On this bag, I am going to add double-sided tape to my bottom seam allowances and fold all of those open. I'm also going to trim some of the bulk in this lining seam, but before I do that, I want to talk about boxing your corners. When you do a boxed corner on your bag, that is what creates the depth on that bag. So the depth of your bag is going to be equal to double your boxed corners, but you do have to consider what your seam allowance is. So for this boxed corner here, we have used a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. So our final depth of the exterior is going to be double this boxed corner minus 1 seam allowance plus 1 seam allowance, because you will take it away from the size of the boxed corner when you sew your bottom and side seams, but then you will add it back in when you box your corner itself. So essentially, if you're using the same seam allowance for the side and the bottom as you use when you sew the corner itself, your depth will be double whatever the size of your boxed corner is. So that's this distance here. For this one, we've taken the greater seam allowance. So even though these two boxes were cut at the same size, it's going to be different because we've used a greater seam allowance. So if we stick with this seam allowance for when we box the corner, it's going to be the same measurement because they're the same size box minus the seam allowance plus the seam allowance is going to end up being the same size. If we want this box to be smaller, we have to take a smaller seam allowance or a smaller box. Because this is already sewn here, the easiest way to make the lining depth smaller than the exterior is, rather than doing the box minus the seam allowance plus the seam allowance to get the depth, do the box minus the seam allowance plus a smaller seam allowance, and that is going to end up with a slightly smaller box. So rather than do 5/8 when I box this corner, that is why I'm going to go with 4/8 or 1/2 inch when I sew up this bottom seam. I'm going to trim back these seam allowances, but remembering that when I box this lining corner, I'm going to use 1/2 inch for my seam allowance, and that will give me a box that is just ever so slightly smaller. It'll be 1/4 inch narrower than my exterior. Just trimming this seam allowance, also trimming part of that slip pocket there, and that's just going to reduce that bulk at the side. And I'll add some double-sided tape to this bottom seam also. And if you like, you can even add a little bit in the sides here too. It can also be helpful if you're concerned about the corners at the top. You can even put some double-sided tape on either side of your exterior so that it will fold out nicely to let that lining just nest inside. And now once that's all folded out, you can open the boxed corner and clip that in place, ready to be sewn up. Sewing the exterior boxed corners at 3/8 of an inch and sewing the lining boxed corners at 1/2 inch. On the bottom boxed corner, I recommend using a narrow foot so that you can get closer to the slip pocket. If you use a regular presser foot, it is kind of tricky to get close enough to the lower end of the slip pocket because of all the layers that are there. And the line of stitches should be parallel to the outside of your bag. I've trimmed all of those threads. Before I turn this out, I'm going to trim the corner here, just within that seam allowance to reduce the bulk. And I'm also going to check to make sure that my zipper pocket is not going to be too big for the lining now that it has been tapered. And I might just sew up this side about 3/8 of an inch, just further in, just to keep that outside of that side seam with the tapered lining piece. We can now turn out our bag through the zipper pocket. When you come to the top corners, you just want to press on that seam allowance from the inside to gently poke out the corner at the end of the zipper. You can, if you like, trim some of the bulk at that corner, just here. And that can also help it to pop out a little more easily. Before you tuck your lining in and close that up, you can consider if you want to add a piece of stabilizer to the inside of your bag exterior just by sliding it in through that opening and then sticking it to the base of your bag. You can use a strong double-sided tape or some adhesive glue just to pop that in the base of your bag to give it a little bit more stability at the bottom. But you can see that because we have got that corner angle nice and flat, we have a really straight bottom and side seam of our bag so that our bag is going to sit nice and stable when we set it down. You can also add some fusible stabilizer to the main panel sections of your exterior to give it some more structure if you want to do that also, once you get a feel for how your bag feels when it's all sewn up. When you're happy with the main part of your bag, you can tuck your entire lining in. I'm going to tuck it all the way in, including the zipper pocket, which we still need to close up, just to get a feel for how the fit of the lining is inside of the bag. Tuck it right down into those corners, and it should fit nice and snugly inside your bag. You can press your lining at the zipper. It's not top stitch, so you can just press that down. You can also put some double-sided tape inside in that seam allowance and press that in place after you finish sewing it all together. I have added a piece of fusible fleece to the exterior back. My piece was 11 inches wide by 6 inches tall, and I've also added a piece of Decaville heavy to my base that was 9 3/8 of an inch wide and 2 3/8 of an inch tall. I've just adhered the Decaville heavy with some double-sided tape, and I fused my fleece to the exterior because I've used cotton, so I was able to fuse that from the outside. I'm going to pull my zipper pocket lining all the way out so that I can close up the bottom of that pocket. We already have our memory fold in place, so I'm just going to pull that zipper pocket taut, clip along that lower edge, and then I will just sew a straight line all the way along. You can fold your side seams in a little to try to hide the bulk and the raw ends. And we're just going to be sewing straight across using a narrow seam allowance as close as you can get to the edge while still making sure that you're catching both sides. And I'm just going to sew straight along here, backstitching at the beginning and at the end. Tuck that zipper pocket in and take whatever strap it is that you are using for your bag. I am just going to be using a webbing strap today, but if you want to do a vinyl or cotton strap, I will link tutorials on how to sew those up. Starting with your adjustable slider, you're going to place your strap over the center, tuck it around, and then for the webbing strap, I'm going to fold mine up to enclose the raw end, and then you can choose to either sew or rivet that section. If you're going to be riveting, then I suggest using some fray check or melting the thread so that you don't get any fraying in your strap. I like to hold my layers together with a clip, punch a hole, and then I will set that first rivet, centering it up, making sure that it is out of the way of that slider. And then I'll set that first rivet. You can experiment to work out your preferred way of attaching your strap. I like to have the folded end down so that I can fully enclose it. Take the other raw end through my rectangle ring, slide it around to enclose the folded end and tuck it back up over the bar and over the fold to create that loop and bring it back around. I like to have it pass through from the front, fold up to the back, fold it over again, and the second time to enclose the raw end, then tuck it up against the other end of my strap so that when you are looking at the bag from the front, you can't see the folds. I'm going to clip that there. And then I'm going to punch a hole and add the fray check the same way as I did where the slider is. Then I'm going to go and set that second rivet. That rivet is now set in place and you're all done. I'll put the link to get your free version of this pattern in the video description so that you can make your very own Rockôtin crossbody bag. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.